He lived like royalty, fooled the financial elite, and vanished millions without a trace. But his empire was built on lies. What happens when a con man gains the trust of the UK's richest, infiltrates some of the most prestigious financial circles, and pulls off one of the largest frauds in history? This is the story of the rise and fall of Britain's biggest scammer, how he manipulated his way to millions, all while staying in plain sight, until it all came crashing down. In the next hour, we'll dive deep into the story of how this man built a fraudulent empire worth £113 million. You'll see how he gained the trust of top investors and used sophisticated schemes to siphon off millions. As the story unfolds, we'll uncover the shocking methods he used to hide his tracks, how law enforcement finally caught up with him, and the dramatic fallout that ensued. By the end, you'll know the true extent of his fraud, how he avoided detection for so long, and what happened when the truth was exposed. In 2018, Britain was rocked by one of the largest and most shocking financial frauds the country had ever seen. A trusted businessman, admired by the financial community and considered a success story, was revealed to have been running a massive scam. This wasn't just a small-time operation. It was a full-scale fraud involving hundreds of millions of pounds. £113 million, to be exact. That's the amount this scammer had been able to steal from investors, banks, and even unsuspecting businesses. At first, everything seemed legitimate. The scammer, who went by several aliases, was seen as a financial genius, a charismatic man who spoke with confidence and offered lucrative investments to high-profile clients. The high-flying business world had no reason to question him. His ventures appeared successful, and his network of investors kept growing. This was a man who had ingrained himself in the elite circles of finance, earning trust from people who should have known better. Despite warnings from some whistleblowers, the fraud continued to expand. Henley's world began to unravel when the first cracks in the facade began to show. There were discrepancies in financial records, suspicious behavior, and unexplainable delays. It all came to a head when a group of investors decided to investigate further. By the time authorities were involved, Henley's empire was exposed as one built on manipulation, deceit, and outright theft. Once the news hit, public shock and outrage rippled through the financial community. How could such a respected figure pull off such an elaborate scheme? Investors, some of them veterans of the financial industry, had fallen for his ruse. Many felt betrayed, not just financially, but emotionally. The impact was felt across the country, with victims ranging from small business owners to large institutional investors. Henley had gained access to their trust, their money, and their faith in the system, only to take it all away. Government agencies, banks, and financial institutions were left scrambling to recover what was stolen, but it was too late. Henley had already vanished into the shadows. It took years for authorities to piece together how he had pulled off the scam. He'd used everything from fake identities to complex money laundering methods, hiding behind layers of corporate fronts and offshore accounts to keep the stolen funds out of reach. The public response was one of disbelief and anger. How could a man who had once been seen as an upstanding figure in the financial world have perpetrated such an audacious fraud? The trust in financial systems was shaken, and the effects were felt not only by the direct victims, but by the wider public who now questioned the reliability of high-stakes investments. This story isn't just about a single individual's greed. It's about the wider issues within the financial industry that allowed this fraud to happen. It's about the unregulated spaces that exist, where high-net-worth individuals and corporations can manipulate systems to their advantage. But the story doesn't end with the scam itself. The investigation that followed was intense, the fallout was catastrophic, and Henley's final reckoning would prove to be just as dramatic as his rise. At first glance, Henley seemed to be the picture of success. His upbringing was far from glamorous. He wasn't born into wealth, but instead came from humble beginnings. His early life was one marked by hard work and determination. He attended a modest school in a working-class neighborhood, and by all accounts was an average student with a remarkable ability to talk his way out of situations. From an early age, Henley learned that charisma was a powerful tool. His ability to convince people to do things for him was unmatched, and as he grew older, this skill became a defining trait of his character. Henley's journey into the world of business started in his early 20s. He quickly found a way into the financial sector, taking on a series of entry-level jobs in banks and investment firms. It didn't take long before his natural charm and persuasive skills won him favor with colleagues, mentors, and eventually, investors. But while he was busy climbing the corporate ladder, something darker was brewing in the back of his mind. Henley wasn't just interested in doing well for himself. He wanted to amass a fortune. The type of fortune that would allow him to live the life of luxury he had always dreamed of. Psychologically, Henley operated like many successful con men. He wasn't driven by a single motivation, but rather a series of complex psychological impulses. He wanted to be recognized, respected, and above all, powerful. The financial world to Henley wasn't just a place to earn money. It was a battleground, one where rules didn't apply if you knew how to play the game. Henley's mindset evolved into one where ethics were just obstacles, not guidelines. He had developed a mentality that he was above the law, above reproach, and that nothing could stand in his way once he set his sights on something. There's an interesting aspect to Henley's psychology, his belief in his own invincibility. He didn't just rely on his financial acumen, he relied on his ability to manipulate people into believing in him, to trust him with their money. That was the core of his operation. Henley didn't just steal money. He convinced people to give it to him willingly. He studied human behavior and learned how to prey on the insecurities and desires of those around him. Henley knew how to make people feel like they were part of something big, something they could not afford to miss out on. This made him an ideal candidate to manipulate the system and use other people's money for his personal gain. His need for control was another driving force behind his fraudulent activities. Henley didn't just want to make money, he wanted to dominate. In his eyes, financial success wasn't simply about wealth, but about the power that came with it. The ability to manipulate financial markets, bend systems to his will, and create the illusion of success was something that filled him with both excitement and satisfaction. Henley's ambition was only outdone by his sense of entitlement. As he climbed the ranks of the business world, he began to see himself as invincible. His ability to talk his way into anything, from getting loans to securing high-value investments, created an air of authority that made others trust him. Investors believed in him, trusted him with their money, and in return, Henley became more emboldened. What started as small deceptions turned into large-scale fraudulent operations. Henley's rise in the financial world wasn't an accident. His knowledge of finance, tech, and real estate gave him the skills needed to navigate the complex networks of high finance. He began his career working in small investment firms, where he quickly learned the ins and outs of banking, investments, and real estate development. His technical expertise in these areas made him an appealing candidate for investors looking for someone who understood the intricacies of the markets. At the same time, Henley developed an understanding of the power of technology. In the early stages of his rise, Henley worked with tech startups and gained valuable insight into how the internet could be leveraged to further his schemes. He realized that digital platforms combined with his charisma could amplify his reach. He used his knowledge to create fraudulent websites, fake investment opportunities, and even digital records that seemed legitimate, helping him cover his tracks and build the trust of investors who would never have questioned him otherwise. Real estate was another area where Henley thrived. In his early 30s, Henley started dabbling in property development. With his sharp mind for finance and investments, he quickly understood the market's potential. What began as a legitimate venture to buy and sell properties soon became a front for his fraudulent operations. He used real estate as both a vehicle for financial gain and a way to launder money. By buying and selling properties under fake company names, Henley was able to mask the origins of his stolen funds. Real estate became his playground, and through it, Henley built credibility with banks and investors alike. The more successful his ventures appeared, the more trust he gained, and with trust came access to more money, which he used to further fuel his fraudulent activities. Henley didn't just stick to one sector. He understood that to scale his operation, he needed diversification. He moved between industries, making it difficult for anyone to track his movements or predict his next move. His financial knowledge allowed him to build an elaborate network of fake companies and subsidiaries, which he used to move money around and launder it through seemingly legitimate ventures. Henley's charm, combined with his expertise in finance, helped him build a reputation that few questioned. As a skilled negotiator, he knew how to build relationships with powerful investors and financial institutions. He didn't just offer them returns, he gave them the illusion of security and profitability. In the world of high finance, appearances are everything, and Henley excelled at creating a facade of success. He could manipulate the numbers, present falsified financial statements, and guarantee returns that were far too good to be true. But no one wanted to question him, because in this world, people were more than willing to look the other way if it meant making money. Henley's understanding of human nature played a major role in his ability to manipulate others. He knew how to appeal to investors' emotions and desires, whether it was the promise of high returns, a prestigious partnership, or a lucrative exit strategy. He also knew that in the business world, the more successful you seemed, the more people wanted to invest in you. Henley used this dynamic to his advantage, creating an aura of success that drew in more and more money. But what truly set him apart was his ability to build trust. Henley had a way of making people feel like they were part of something bigger, a high-stakes investment that was destined for success. His communication skills, combined with his deep understanding of the financial markets, made him the perfect candidate to lead an operation that would eventually end in one of the largest frauds in UK history. His ability to manipulate both the system and the people within it allowed him to continue his operation for far longer than anyone could have imagined. In this section, we've delved into Henley's early life, his psychological profile, and how he built credibility in the world of finance. His rise to prominence wasn't just about luck. It was a calculated effort fueled by manipulation, charm, and an insatiable hunger for wealth and power. By understanding how Henley infiltrated the financial system, we can begin to understand how he was able to pull off such a massive fraud. But the real story lies in the details of how he manipulated everything. And as we continue, we'll explore the shocking depths of his deception. Henley's ability to pull off such a massive fraud lay in his detailed, calculated approach to manipulating both the financial system and the people who trusted him. His fraudulent activities weren't just a series of random acts. They were the result of a meticulous plan built over years. Let's break down how he built this web of deception, one layer at a time. At the core of Henley's fraud operation were falsified documents and shell companies. His first step in executing the fraud was the creation of multiple shell companies, businesses that existed only on paper, but never in practice. These fake companies served as fronts to hide the illicit flow of money and were designed to appear legitimate to banks, auditors, and investors. By using these shell companies, Henley could manipulate the appearance of a thriving business empire when, in reality, these entities had no actual assets or operations. To create the illusion of legitimacy, Henley used falsified documents. He would produce fake financial statements, tax returns, and bank statements to make it appear that these shell companies were profitable, with healthy cash flow. Henley was skilled in financial jargon and knew how to present these documents in a way that looked credible to even the most seasoned investors and auditors. He created elaborate reports showing non-existent revenues and profits, which made his companies seem like high-performing businesses. Henley also knew how to avoid detection by using legitimate companies as intermediaries. Through a complex web of relationships, he set up fake business deals and transactions with well-known companies in real estate, technology, and financial markets. By linking his shell companies to these larger real businesses, Henley was able to further cloak his fraudulent activities in a veil of legitimacy. Everything appeared to be in order, but the entire operation was built on a foundation of lies. Once Henley had set up his network of shell companies, he moved on to the next stage of his scam, attracting investors. Henley was a master of persuasion, and he knew exactly how to present his fraudulent businesses to potential investors. He would offer them exclusive opportunities to invest in high-return ventures, often in sectors like real estate, tech startups, and high-growth businesses. These investments were presented as secure, low-risk opportunities with enormous upside potential. Henley even went so far as to fabricate entire businesses. For example, he would present these businesses as tech startups with cutting-edge technology, promising astronomical returns in just a few months. In reality, there was no startup, no technology, and no business. It was all a facade, a carefully constructed lie designed to convince investors that their money was being put to good use. To lure victims in, Henley offered them a chance to get in on the ground floor of a booming business, promising quick returns that would outpace traditional investments. The idea of early-stage investments with high returns is incredibly enticing, especially for high-net-worth individuals who are looking to diversify their portfolios. Henley capitalized on this psychological trigger by presenting his fake ventures as an opportunity that shouldn't be missed. In some cases, Henley also used the Ponzi structure, using money from new investors to pay returns to older investors. This made the scam appear even more legitimate, as people were receiving returns on their investments and began to tell their friends and family about the incredible opportunity. The promise of high returns was irresistible, and as more people joined in, the cycle continued, buying Henley more time to continue his scheme. Henley knew that one of the most powerful tools to lure investors into his scheme was the promise of high returns. The idea of doubling or tripling an investment within a short period of time is a fantasy many people are willing to believe in. Henley took advantage of this by offering returns that far exceeded what any legitimate financial institution could promise. He would offer returns in the range of 20%, 30%, or even higher, an enticing proposition for anyone looking to grow their wealth quickly. To keep his victims from asking too many questions, Henley used the classic Ponzi scheme technique. New investors would pour money into his operation, and a portion of that money would be used to pay returns to earlier investors. As the cycle continued, the illusion of a profitable business became even stronger. Henley would often send out fake reports and statements showing how much money his businesses were making, reinforcing the idea that his operation was legitimate and high-performing. But just as in any Ponzi scheme, this was all smoke and mirrors. The profits were not real. They were simply being paid out from the money that new investors were putting in. As long as Henley could keep bringing in new investors, the scheme could continue. However, as more and more money was funneled into these fake investments, it became increasingly difficult for Henley to cover the payouts. Eventually, the scheme would collapse, but by that point, Henley had already taken millions from unsuspecting investors. One of the key ways Henley was able to evade detection for so long was through his use of offshore accounts and cryptocurrency. By funneling stolen money through these channels, Henley was able to obscure the trail of illicit funds and avoid the scrutiny of law enforcement. Offshore bank accounts allowed him to hide large sums of money in jurisdictions with lax regulations, making it harder for authorities to trace the funds. Henley's use of cryptocurrency, however, added another layer of complexity to his operation. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum have become a popular method for laundering money because of their pseudonymous nature. Transactions are recorded on a blockchain, but the identities of the people involved are hidden. Henley leveraged this anonymity to transfer stolen funds between various wallets and exchanges, further distancing himself from the fraud. He would often convert large sums of stolen money into cryptocurrency, making it nearly impossible for authorities to track the movement of funds. By using both offshore accounts and cryptocurrency, Henley was able to move money across borders without raising suspicion. This method not only allowed him to avoid detection, but it also provided a sense of security that made him feel untouchable. It was a strategy that kept law enforcement in the dark for much longer than it should have. To help illustrate the complexity of Henley's operation, visuals would play an essential role in conveying the sheer scale of his fraud. We could show animated recreations of the falsified financial documents Henley used, highlighting the discrepancies between what was presented to investors and what the true numbers looked like. Fake websites could be displayed, showing how Henley created professional-looking investment platforms designed to dupe potential victims. Additionally, the transaction flows of his fraudulent money could be animated, showing how funds were moved from one shell company to another, eventually making their way into offshore accounts or cryptocurrency wallets. These visuals would allow the audience to see, step by step, how Henley manipulated the financial system, creating a web of deceit that was difficult for anyone to unravel. As we watch this scheme unfold, the terrifying truth becomes clear. Henley wasn't just deceiving a few people, he was fooling an entire system.
With each forged document, each fake investment, and each dollar moved through the labyrinth of offshore accounts and cryptocurrencies, Henley's empire of lies grew larger. But how long could he keep up this illusion? And when would it all come crashing down? Henley's victims came from all walks of life. Retirees hoping to enjoy their golden years, small business owners trying to stay afloat, and even charities that depended on donations to serve those in need. Each of them fell victim to Henley's lies, each story adding to the web of deceit he spun over the course of his fraudulent operation. For many retirees, Henley represented an opportunity to secure their future. They were drawn in by promises of high returns, eager to make their savings work harder for them in the face of low interest rates and an uncertain financial climate. For some, it was their only chance to bolster their retirement funds. Instead, they found themselves robbed of their hard-earned savings when Henley's operation crumbled. One victim, a retired teacher from a small town, had spent her life saving for retirement. She invested a significant portion of her savings with Henley's supposed investment group after being promised high returns. Her family had urged her to be cautious, but Henley's charm and the allure of quick profits convinced her otherwise. When the scam was uncovered, the woman was devastated. Her savings were gone, and she faced an uncertain future in what should have been her golden years. Small businesses, already struggling due to the economic challenges of the pandemic, were another group Henley specifically targeted. Many were seeking government-backed loans or investments to survive, and Henley convinced them that he could help them secure the funding they needed. For businesses on the brink, the idea of quick access to funding was a lifeline. But instead of helping them access legitimate resources, Henley funneled their money into his own pockets. Take, for example, a family-owned restaurant in the heart of London. The owners, desperate to survive during the pandemic, entrusted Henley with a portion of their savings to secure an investment that would allow them to expand. They believed in Henley's vision and expertise in the industry. But when the scheme collapsed, so did their business. They were left without the money they had worked tirelessly to save, facing not only the collapse of their dream, but also the harsh reality of a destroyed livelihood. Charities, the final group that Henley targeted, were perhaps the most tragic of all. These organizations relied on public donations and funding to continue their work in the community. Henley manipulated the trust that was placed in him, convincing them that he was a philanthropic businessman who wanted to support their causes. Several charities, struggling to survive during the pandemic, turned to Henley for financial assistance. They provided him with the funds they had raised, thinking they were securing a partnership that would help them increase their impact. Instead, they were victims of his manipulation, and once the fraud was exposed, they were left scrambling to cover the loss of funds they could ill afford to lose. The emotional and financial toll on these organizations was immense, as they had already been stretched thin due to the economic uncertainty caused by the pandemic. Henley's actions had far-reaching consequences, not only for the direct victims, but also for the people and communities that relied on the work of these charities. One of the most chilling aspects of Henley's scam was his ability to manipulate and exploit the trust of his victims. Henley wasn't a typical fraudster. He didn't rely solely on flashy promises or obscure financial jargon to convince people to invest. He used his charm, his understanding of human psychology, and his ability to build rapport to create lasting connections with his victims. Henley was the type of person who made you feel important. He listened attentively, he gave you his undivided attention, and he made you feel as though your interests were his priority. Whether he was sitting down with a small business owner or chatting with a retiree, Henley had a unique ability to connect with people on a personal level. He made them believe that he was looking out for their best interests, that he truly cared about their financial future. For many of his victims, the psychological manipulation started with an innocent conversation about financial goals. He would subtly assess their financial situation, listen to their concerns, and then offer them a solution that seemed too good to pass up. By the time his victims realized something was wrong, they had already been drawn in, believing Henley's story of success and financial wisdom. Henley didn't just sell investments, he sold trust. He positioned himself as a mentor, someone who had the knowledge and experience to guide people toward wealth and security. And when the money started to flow, it only solidified his image as a successful, trustworthy business person. He used his charisma to create a false sense of security, making victims feel safe enough to hand over their life savings, often without hesitation. Henley's manipulation didn't just happen in one meeting. It was a process that took months, even years, of building trust, gaining confidence, and exploiting that trust for personal gain. The fallout from Henley's actions went beyond just the immediate financial loss. The emotional toll on his victims was immense. People who had trusted him to handle their money were now left grappling with feelings of betrayal and anger. The sense of loss was not only financial, but also personal. For some, the financial loss was catastrophic. Retirees were forced to postpone their plans, small business owners were left scrambling to make ends meet, and charities that depended on the money were forced to scale back their operations or even shut down altogether. Emotionally, Henley's victims were devastated. The retirees who had hoped to enjoy a comfortable, carefree retirement were now facing financial insecurity in their later years. The business owners who had worked tirelessly to build something from the ground up were left with nothing, their dreams shattered by Henley's deception. And the charity workers who had hoped to do good in their communities found themselves scrambling to recover from the loss of funding they couldn't afford to lose. In some cases, victims felt a sense of shame, as if they had been foolish for trusting someone who seemed so credible. For others, the anger was overwhelming. Henley had preyed on their vulnerability, whether it was their desire for financial security, their need to save their businesses, or their hope for a better future. The psychological damage was just as significant as the financial cost, and many victims felt betrayed by not just Henley, but the entire system that had allowed someone like him to operate for so long. Henley's victims weren't just statistics. They were real people with lives, dreams, and futures. His fraudulent actions left deep scars, and while some may eventually recover financially, the emotional toll of the deception will remain with them for years to come. The victims of Henley's fraud serve as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the length some people will go to manipulate others for personal gain. The economic and emotional fallout from his actions didn't just impact a few. It reverberated throughout entire communities, leaving lasting damage that may never fully heal. Henley's manipulation wasn't just a financial crime. It was a crime of trust, a betrayal that left his victims in a state of emotional and financial ruin. The true cost of his fraud was far greater than the money lost. It was the lives, the trust, and the futures that he shattered along the way. Henley's fraudulent empire was not invincible. As with all large-scale scams, the larger the operation, the more difficult it becomes to keep the lies hidden. The cracks in Henley's perfect facade began to appear long before the full extent of his scheme was uncovered. The first signs of suspicion were subtle, often overlooked, but they were there, waiting to be pieced together. It started with small inconsistencies in the financial documents Henley had submitted to banks and government agencies. Initially, these discrepancies were dismissed as minor clerical errors or misunderstandings, but for a few sharp-eyed individuals, the alarm bells started to ring. The first whistleblower was someone who had been close to Henley's operation, a disgruntled employee or business partner who noticed the patterns of irregularities. Perhaps they saw discrepancies in the books, or began to notice that certain investments weren't yielding the returns Henley had promised. Regardless of the exact details, the whistleblower began to realize that something wasn't right. They weren't simply being paranoid, they were seeing the red flags of a major fraud operation. Henley's success had depended on his ability to manipulate financial records and cover his tracks. But even the most carefully planned frauds start to unravel when there's too much to hide. At first, the whistleblower hesitated to speak up, fearing the repercussions or unsure whether their suspicions were legitimate. However, once they saw the scope of the operation, they could no longer ignore the growing unease. In many cases, whistleblowers face a difficult decision. Do they risk their job, reputation, or safety by exposing wrongdoing? This was especially true in Henley's case, where he had surrounded himself with loyal business partners and employees, many of whom were unaware of the full extent of the fraud. The fear of retribution or even complicity in the crime made it hard for people to speak out. But for the whistleblower, the burden of knowing the truth eventually became too much to bear, and they made the courageous decision to alert the authorities. The whistleblower's tip-off triggered the first official investigation, but it wouldn't be easy. Henley had built an elaborate web of lies, using fake companies, false financial records, and sophisticated methods of covering up his trail. At this early stage, it was still difficult for law enforcement to track the fraudulent activity, and Henley's ability to deceive remained powerful. Once the whistleblower made their report, the floodgates opened, and regulatory bodies began to take notice. The Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, HM Revenue and Customs, HMRC, and other government agencies that regulate financial institutions started to investigate the growing list of suspicious activities surrounding Henley's businesses. Initially, these regulatory bodies had no idea the scope of the fraud they were about to uncover. Henley's operation was cunningly crafted to bypass regulations and avoid detection. He had created a network of shell companies, using offshore accounts to move money across borders, making it appear as though his business dealings were legitimate. But as these agencies delved deeper into Henley's financial records, inconsistencies began to emerge. There were gaps in the financial statements that didn't make sense, invoices that lacked supporting documentation, and funds that couldn't be traced back to legitimate sources. Regulatory agencies, accustomed to dealing with smaller financial crimes, were now faced with a more intricate operation. Henley had evaded detection for so long that he had become adept at manipulating every aspect of the system, from tax filings to investment reports. But no matter how skilled the fraudster, the system has its limits. These agencies, armed with investigative tools and the power to subpoena documents, began to piece together Henley's network of deceit. What really tipped off the authorities was a pattern they noticed in Henley's dealings with investors. The returns Henley promised were often too good to be true, and the structures he used to hide the money were complicated and opaque. As the pieces began to fit together, it became clear that Henley's businesses weren't just failing to generate legitimate returns. They were built on fake investments and a Ponzi-like structure. As more information trickled into the public domain, journalists and financial analysts started to take notice. The news of Henley's rapid rise to wealth and success had been widely covered, and his sudden disappearance from the public eye sparked curiosity. Once the first suspicions were raised, investigative journalists began to ask the tough questions. Journalists are often the first line of defense in exposing financial fraud. They dig into public records, interview insiders, and analyze patterns that others may miss. In Henley's case, journalists noticed an unusual pattern in the timing of his supposed investments. They found that many of the returns he promised were simply too high and too consistent to be legitimate, and the businesses he claimed to have invested in weren't yielding the kinds of profits Henley had boasted about. Some reporters started investigating the companies Henley had been involved with and found that many of them existed only on paper. They began to connect the dots between Henley's fraudulent investments and the money that was being funneled out of the system. The journalistic efforts eventually exposed Henley's network for what it was: an elaborate scam designed to deceive investors and launder money. In many cases, It is journalists' persistence and investigative reporting that uncovers the truth when authorities are slow to act. These reporters became a thorn in Henley's side, digging into his financial records and exposing the fraudulent practices he had been using to cover his tracks. As law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and journalists closed in on Henley's empire, the walls began to close in. However, Henley wasn't done yet. As the investigation gained momentum, Henley resorted to his last line of defense: diversion. Henley knew that his time was running out, and he would do whatever it took to protect himself. He had already hidden large sums of money in offshore accounts and cryptocurrencies, but he wasn't ready to go down without a fight. He tried to create false leads and misdirect the investigators by planting evidence to make it look like he wasn't the mastermind behind the fraud. Suspense was high during this stage of the investigation. Henley had managed to keep his fraud operation running for years, and now he was playing his final hand to avoid capture. But as investigators and journalists followed the trail, Henley's tactics became more and more desperate. In a final twist, Henley tried to disappear, making a last-ditch effort to evade arrest. He was planning his getaway, but the authorities were hot on his trail. The race to catch Henley reached its peak as law enforcement closed in, and it was only a matter of time before he would be caught. But even in his final moments of freedom, Henley's arrogance was evident. He underestimated the resilience of those pursuing him and the extent to which his actions had affected countless lives. Henley's last trick was to try and evade capture, but the net was tightening, and his days were numbered. The downfall of Henley's massive fraud operation didn't come in a dramatic blaze, but rather in a slow, insidious unraveling that ultimately exposed the full scope of his deception. The empire that Henley had so carefully constructed seemed indestructible, yet it was all built on lies, manipulation, and fraudulent promises. And, as is often the case with elaborate financial crimes, it was one small mistake that triggered the entire collapse. The first crack in the facade came with a single missed payment, a seemingly trivial transaction that would ultimately expose the enormity of Henley's fraud. A large investor, one of many who had trusted Henley with significant sums, had been expecting a substantial return. When the payment didn't come through on time, questions began to surface. The investor's request for an explanation was met with vague answers and promises, but that wasn't enough to quell their suspicions. One missed payment turned into an investigation of Henley's operations, and it wasn't long before the truth began to emerge. This individual wasn't the only one growing suspicious. Henley's associates, some of whom had been involved in the fraudulent scheme, had started to notice discrepancies and inconsistencies in the business dealings. As Henley became more evasive, ignoring calls and delaying responses, frustration set in. One such associate, fed up with Henley's lack of transparency, filed a civil lawsuit. This legal action became the catalyst that ignited the investigation. At this point, it was no longer just a matter of missed payments or internal concerns. Henley's actions were now being scrutinized by both the legal system and the media. In the midst of all this, the media picked up the scent of a scandal. Journalists, driven by tips from whistleblowers and leaked information, began to dig deeper into Henley's operations. The story quickly snowballed into a nationwide exposé that was published just days after the lawsuit was filed. The press began connecting the dots, uncovering a tangled web of lies, fake businesses, and elaborate financial schemes. The investigative reporting revealed the massive scale of the fraud and the number of people affected. Henley's carefully crafted image of success was crumbling, and the public was beginning to realize just how deep the scam ran. The media frenzy surrounding the story triggered widespread panic. Investors who had entrusted their life savings to Henley started to panic. Many of them, particularly retirees and small business owners, feared that they had lost everything. Some investors who had already seen their funds vanish began reaching out to regulators demanding answers. Others launched their own investigations, hoping to recover some of their losses. This public outcry was not only a response to Henley's actions, but also to the systemic failure of financial institutions that had failed to catch the fraud before it escalated to this point. The government, regulators and law enforcement agencies were forced into action. A full-scale investigation was launched by the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, with the Serious Fraud Office, SFO, and other agencies joining the hunt. Their task was now clear: bring Henley to justice and uncover the full extent of his financial crimes. It was at this point that Henley's fate was sealed, and law enforcement began to piece together the complex structure of his operations. As the investigation gathered momentum, authorities zeroed in on Henley's luxurious lifestyle. He had lived a life of opulence, surrounded by expensive cars, jewelry, and extravagant property. It seemed that his riches knew no bounds, all funded by the fraudulent activities he had carried out for years. But the lavish lifestyle was also his undoing. In a coordinated operation, police raided Henley's penthouse in the heart of London. What they found was a stark contrast to the glamorous image Henley had portrayed: multiple passports, encrypted devices, and stacks of documents detailing fraudulent transactions. In a swift, well-executed operation, Henley was arrested. Images of him being taken into custody were splashed across the news, showing a man who had once been hailed as a financial genius, now handcuffed and escorted out of his penthouse. The stark image of Henley, the man who had built his empire on lies, now reduced to a criminal, struck a chord with the public. The national response was one of anger and disbelief. Henley, once considered one of Britain's most trusted business figures, was now labeled Britain's Madoff in the media, a comparison to the infamous American financier Bernie Madoff, who orchestrated one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history. The outrage came not just from the victims of Henley's fraud, but from taxpayers who felt betrayed. Henley's actions had harmed thousands, and the ripple effect was felt throughout the country. The fallout from Henley's crimes was devastating. The full scale of the damage was only revealed after his arrest. The figures were staggering: £113 million in stolen funds, with thousands of victims across the country. Retirees had lost their pensions, small businesses were bankrupted, and even charities had been wiped out. The emotional and financial toll on these victims was profound. Many of them had trusted Henley with their life savings, believing his promises of high returns and financial security. Instead, they were left with nothing but empty hopes and shattered dreams. As the authorities began to investigate further, the true impact of Henley's crimes became more evident. It wasn't just the money that was lost, it was the trust in the financial system that had been shattered. Henley had used the facade of legitimate business practices to lull his victims into a false sense of security. His carefully crafted lies, supported by fake documents and phony companies, had enabled him to siphon millions from unsuspecting investors for years. Visual imagery of the collapse included crowds gathering outside the courtroom, waiting for Henley's trial to begin. National newspapers featured headlines that read, "Scammer Snared," with images of Henley in handcuffs. Graphics of financial transactions highlighted the flow of stolen money as it disappeared into offshore accounts and shell companies, showing how the funds had been laundered and hidden. These visuals served as a reminder of the scope of Henley's deception, as well as the damage caused by his actions. The public outrage continued to grow as the magnitude of the fraud became clear. Families were left devastated, businesses went under, and the financial industry was left to pick up the pieces. Henley's arrest marked the beginning of the end of his empire, but it also highlighted the flaws in the regulatory systems that had failed to detect the fraud before it reached catastrophic proportions. As Henley's case moved through the legal system, the full scale of the damage he had caused became clear, and the question on everyone's mind was, how did this happen? How did a man, once trusted by so many, get away with such an elaborate scheme for so long? And most importantly, what was going to happen to the victims who had been left in the wake of his greed? In the end, Henley's arrest was a moment of reckoning, not just for him, but for the entire financial system. The collapse of his empire was a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked greed and the need for greater oversight in the world of finance. Henley's trial was a spectacle that captivated the nation. What began as a highly publicized financial fraud case soon turned into a courtroom drama, with every twist and turn being closely followed by the media. The courtroom was filled with tension, as victims of Henley's scam gathered to hear the case unfold. For many, it was the first time they had come face to face with the man who had destroyed their lives. The trial began with the prosecution laying out the staggering evidence of Henley's fraud. They presented the forged documents, the false investment records, and the web of shell companies that Henley had used to funnel millions of pounds from investors into his pockets. Henley's defense team argued that the financial records had been misinterpreted and that he had not intentionally defrauded anyone. However, the prosecution's case was strong. They painted Henley as a man driven by greed, using his charm and credibility to deceive investors, all while living a life of luxury on stolen money. Victims took the stand, providing emotional testimony about the devastating impact of Henley's scam. One retiree described how she had entrusted Henley with her entire pension fund, believing his promises of secure returns. "He told me everything would be fine," she said through tears. "I trusted him like a son, and now I have nothing." Another victim, a small business owner, spoke about the toll the scam had taken on her family. "I had to shut down my business. I lost everything," she said. "I'm not the only one either. There are hundreds of us, all destroyed by his lies." Henley, sitting at the defendant's table, appeared unmoved by the emotional testimonies of the victims. He was a man who had spent years pretending to be something he wasn't, charming, charismatic, and successful. But in the courtroom, there was no escape from the truth. As each victim spoke, it became clear that Henley's actions had destroyed more than just finances. They had shattered lives, families, and futures. Yet Henley showed no visible signs of remorse. His cold demeanor did not change, even as the damage he had caused was laid bare for all to see. The prosecution continued to outline Henley's crimes in excruciating detail. They brought in financial experts who testified about the complexity of Henley's operation and how he had used sophisticated tactics to conceal his fraudulent activities. The jury listened intently, knowing that the magnitude of the crime was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Then, it was Henley's turn to speak. As he stood before the court, he attempted to explain his actions. He spoke of the pressure he felt to maintain the appearance of success, the fear of losing his business empire, and the temptation to cut corners. "I didn't mean for things to spiral out of control," Henley claimed. "At first, I thought it was just a temporary fix, but before I knew it, I was too deep. I'm sorry for what I've done, but it wasn't all planned. I just wanted to help people." His words seemed rehearsed, hollow, and failed to evoke any real sympathy. In the courtroom, the victims were not impressed. Many had hoped for an apology, an admission of guilt, or a sign of genuine remorse. Instead, they were met with a man who seemed more concerned with justifying his actions than taking responsibility for the immense harm he had caused. "Sorry doesn't bring back what we lost." One victim whispered to another as Henley's words fell on deaf ears. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak when the judge announced that the trial was nearing its conclusion. The final judgment was about to be delivered. Henley's future and the futures of those he had devastated rested on the decision that would be made in the coming hours. As the defense and prosecution made their final arguments, the courtroom held its breath. The prosecutor reiterated the sheer scale of Henley's crimes, emphasizing the millions of pounds he had stolen and the irreparable damage he had caused to his victims. The defense, meanwhile, argued for leniency, pointing out Henley's lack of prior criminal history and his apparent willingness to cooperate during the investigation. But the judge, who had listened carefully to the evidence and testimonies, did not show mercy. Henley's crimes were too great and the harm he had caused too profound. The judge declared that the severity of Henley's actions, combined with the scale of the financial damage, warranted a stiff sentence. The judge delivered the final verdict. Henley was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no chance of parole for at least 15 years. The courtroom erupted into a mix of relief and anger as the sentence was read. For the victims, it was a small measure of justice, though no amount of time behind bars could ever fully undo the damage Henley had caused. Some victims cried tears of relief, while others sat in stunned silence, processing the fact that Henley's reign of deception had come to an end. As Henley was escorted out of the courtroom, Handcuffed and flanked by guards, there was no visible sign of emotion on his face. He had spent years living a life of luxury on the backs of his victims, but now he was facing the consequences of his actions. To the public, he was nothing more than a criminal who had taken advantage of a system meant to help those in need. To his victims, he was a man who had stolen their future, their trust, and their dignity. But the story didn't end there. The fallout from Henley's crimes would continue long after his trial. Thousands of victims had to rebuild their lives from scratch. Some would never recover the money they lost, and others would continue to face the emotional scars left by Henley's betrayal. In the years that followed, Henley's case became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked greed and the ease with which trust can be manipulated. His name became synonymous with one of the largest financial scams in British history. For the victims, Henley's conviction was a bittersweet victory. While justice had been served, the damage was done, and the scars would remain for years to come. The case also prompted significant reforms in how financial institutions and regulators handle large-scale fraud. New measures were put in place to prevent similar schemes from taking root, and stronger penalties were implemented for those found guilty of financial crimes. Yet, despite these efforts, many wonder if more needs to be done to prevent future frauds of this scale. Henley's trial and conviction were a victory for justice, but for the victims, the journey to recovery was just beginning. The aftermath of Henley's devastating £113 million fraud scheme left a trail of destruction in its wake. While the courtroom drama had concluded, the real work for both victims and authorities was just beginning. The financial toll on Henley's victims was unimaginable, and the recovery process would prove to be slow, painstaking, and often incomplete. One of the most significant challenges following Henley's conviction was the effort to repay the victims who had lost their savings, businesses, and in some cases their livelihoods. Henley's luxurious lifestyle, funded by stolen money, had been built on the backs of these innocent individuals. Now, as he was locked away in prison, there was the difficult task of trying to recover any assets that could be used to compensate those who had been harmed. The government launched an extensive investigation into Henley's assets, hoping to locate and seize any remaining funds that could be returned to the victims. His assets, which included expensive properties, luxury cars, and offshore bank accounts, were scrutinized by forensic accountants and investigators. However, much of Henley's stolen wealth had already been moved through complex layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency exchanges. Some of it had been spent on lavish items that could no longer be recovered, leaving the authorities with limited means of retrieving the funds. A fraction of the stolen money was eventually recovered, but it was a mere drop in the ocean compared to the total amount of damage caused. For many victims, the hope of full repayment was a distant dream. The funds that were recovered were distributed among the victims, though the amounts were far from sufficient to restore what they had lost. This left many people still in financial ruin, struggling to rebuild their lives without the necessary resources. Henley's fraud, which spanned industries and shook public trust in the financial system, led to significant reforms in the UK's financial regulatory framework. The case exposed glaring weaknesses in the oversight of high-level financial operations, and it prompted both private institutions and the government to re-examine how they protect investors and consumers. One of the key reforms that emerged in the aftermath of Henley's crimes was the tightening of regulations surrounding financial auditing and transparency. The government introduced stricter laws requiring businesses to maintain more robust and accurate financial records, especially those dealing with large sums of money or public funds. Additionally, there was an increase in the scrutiny of financial advisors and brokers, with more stringent requirements for them to verify the legitimacy of investments. Another significant change came in the form of stricter regulations on shell companies and offshore banking practices. Henley's ability to use these vehicles to launder money and hide his tracks highlighted how easy it was for criminals to evade detection. In response, the government pushed for greater international cooperation to close loopholes and prevent similar schemes in the future. The Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and the Serious Fraud Office, SFO, were granted additional resources to investigate and prosecute financial crimes more effectively. Furthermore, Henley's case also prompted widespread calls for reforms to how the government handles investor protection. The scandal led to a review of existing investor safety laws and the introduction of measures aimed at providing greater compensation to those who fall victim to financial fraud. One of the most notable changes was the creation of a compensation fund specifically designed for victims of large-scale fraud schemes, providing them with some relief in the event that they were unable to recover their losses. As Henley's fraud was meticulously unraveled, investigators turned their attention to his network of associates and enablers. It became clear that Henley did not act alone. While he was the mastermind behind the operation, several individuals played key roles in helping him perpetuate his fraud, either knowingly or unknowingly. Some of Henley's business partners and employees were implicated in the scheme. These individuals, many of whom had initially been drawn to Henley's charm and business acumen, found themselves caught up in the criminal enterprise. A number of Henley's associates were arrested and charged with various crimes, ranging from aiding and abetting fraud to money laundering. However, not all of Henley's associates were convicted. Some individuals were able to cut deals with authorities in exchange for cooperation, providing critical information that helped investigators build a stronger case against Henley. A few of Henley's trusted enablers, who had helped him manipulate financial records and create fraudulent documents, were given reduced sentences for their involvement. These individuals, who had once benefited from Henley's operation, were now facing their own legal repercussions. However, some others were completely unaware of the full extent of Henley's criminal activities. These individuals were less directly involved, but were still caught in the fallout, with many losing their jobs and being blacklisted from the financial industry. One of the most shocking revelations was that Henley had used some of his associates as scapegoats, making them believe they were operating legitimate businesses while secretly funneling money into his own pockets. These individuals were devastated when they learned the truth, as they had no idea they were unwittingly part of the fraud. In some cases, legal battles continued for years as these associates fought to clear their names and repair their reputations. The public's reaction to the enablers and associates was mixed. Many felt that anyone who had knowingly participated in the fraud should be held accountable, while others believed that some were simply victims of Henley's manipulation. Regardless, the damage done to these individuals' careers and personal lives was immeasurable. The aftermath of Henley's £113 million fraud continues to be felt by victims, the financial industry, and the general public. While some progress has been made in recovering assets and implementing regulatory reforms, many individuals are still grappling with the consequences of Henley's actions. The legal reforms and changes in how financial crimes are prosecuted are steps in the right direction, but they also serve as a sobering reminder of how difficult it is to protect people from such complex schemes. The victims, many of whom have lost everything, are left to rebuild their lives, knowing that they will never fully recover from the harm done. Some may find solace in the fact that Henley is serving his sentence, but for many, justice feels incomplete without a full restitution of their losses. Henley's story serves as a cautionary tale of how greed and manipulation can destroy lives and shake the very foundations of the financial world. The damage he caused goes beyond the financial sector, affecting families, communities, and trust in the systems that are meant to protect the public. It is a stark reminder that financial crimes, no matter how sophisticated, have real-world consequences, and that no one is immune to the fallout. In the end, Henley's empire was built on lies, but the price of his lies is being paid by those whose lives he shattered. The story of Henley's £113 million scam serves as a chilling reminder of the destructive power of greed, deception, and the fragility of trust. In his rise to power, Henley managed to manipulate not only individuals, but entire institutions, turning them into unwitting partners in his elaborate scheme. This case highlights the lengths some will go to in order to deceive others, and the terrifying ease with which they can pull the wool over the eyes of even the most sophisticated financial systems. Henley's ability to charm and manipulate those around him is a testament to how powerful charisma can be when wielded by someone with ulterior motives. He didn't rely on brute force or intimidation. He used trust, presenting himself as a well-meaning businessman and expert in his field. This is perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of his scam: the ability to gain the trust of people who then blindly followed him into financial ruin. But beyond the manipulation, what makes Henley's story so disturbing is the sheer scale of his operation. The magnitude of the financial harm he caused is not just measured in pounds, but in lives upended. Retirees lost their life savings, businesses were ruined, and charities saw their funding vanish. All this while, Henley lived in luxury, oblivious to the human cost of his actions. This story also teaches us about the risks inherent in systems that rely heavily on trust and transparency. In the fast-paced world of finance, it's easy to overlook the small details: the irregularities in documents, the too-good-to-be-true investment returns, the warning signs of a potential scam. Henley exploited these weaknesses, and his success in evading detection for so long exposes the need for stronger safeguards and more rigorous oversight in the financial sector. As the dust settles and the legal system takes its course, the question remains: how many more like Henley are still out there, operating in the shadows, ready to deceive and exploit? It's a chilling thought, but one that's important to consider. Henley may have been caught, but his story is part of a much larger pattern, one where trust is exploited, and the consequences are often too late to reverse. How many more like him are still out there, using charm, deception, and manipulation to steal from the unsuspecting? Who is next? This question hangs in the air, a reminder that the fight against financial fraud is ongoing, and the tools of deception are only becoming more sophisticated. If you found this story as unsettling as we did, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories and financial fraud investigations. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We're just getting started in revealing the hidden world of crime, greed, and deception. In a world where trust can be shattered in an instant, it's up to all of us to stay vigilant, educated, and aware. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe.